Hey guys, Stefan and Simon are here to talk with us about jurisdictional arbitrage or being expats in a different country. Welcome to the show, Stefan and Simon.
Thank
Hey,
you.
thanks for having us.
Yeah, you guys are both very interesting sort of cases. I mean, Stefan, you obviously do your podcast, and Simon, you do development on mempool that space. I'd like to start off by asking, like, wait, how'd you end up where you are, right? And what led to that decision?
Yeah, Simon, do you want to go? Yeah.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's a long journey if I'm going to tell the whole story. But I mean, I started when I grew up in Sweden. I was working in development, and then I got into reading more about Austrian economics, libertarianism, and that stuff. So I got those ideas, and then I started to become more interested in Bitcoin. And then at one point, after doing some travel, I was living in China for a while and come back. I started to get a more broader view of the world, that the world is not just centered around where you live, right? So I always had this itch that I would like to live abroad, live in some country that is more like free. I had a dream of going to live in Singapore at one point because it was like the role model capitalist country where it's like high salary, safe and low taxes and all that. But eventually I ended up moving to Malta back in 2017. And one of the reasons was that I wanted to move to a Bitcoin friendly jurisdiction. And Bitcoin was officially no tax on Bitcoin at that point. So I moved there, but I stayed there for a while, but then I started moving elsewhere. And now I'm based in Dubai. But I think that initial jump outside of Sweden is like the biggest step, like leaving your home country, moving somewhere else. It's just like it brought in your mind some at a point you can't imagine before you actually do it yourself. And you start to change your worldview. And I wanted to focus on Bitcoin full time, which I did. I was starting to develop some projects. And in 2018, I started to develop the mempool.space website, which took off as a successful project as it is now, which is great. So I'm working on it full time now. So that's basically my story.
Great. All right. So again, I won't do my whole life story, but I'll give a quick kind of synopsis, and you tell me wherever you want to dig into. But born in Sri Lanka, but raised in Australia. And for most of my life now, I was a libertarian, but for most of my life, I probably wasn't that serious about trying to go overseas. It wasn't a big deal to me. But obviously, in 2020, the hysteria happened, and I was locked into the country. And this was at a point where I was getting invited to speak at events, and I was quite literally just being stopped from doing my job. And at the same time, being forced to pay very high taxes in Australia, it made me think very much about escape plans. And so that was where I became a lot more open-minded to actually going and living in other countries. Now, previously I'd traveled around a reasonable amount. I wasn't like the biggest traveler out there, but I had some experience, and I also had some exposure to the idea that, you know what, just because you're born somewhere doesn't mean you have to die there. That there are options around the world, depending on where you're from and so on. Can you lower your taxes? Can you go somewhere that's lower cost of living? Can you go somewhere with a different culture that's more amenable to how you would like to live? There's all kinds of other things that you can explore when you start looking beyond just the place that you were born in or just the place that you grew up in.
Well, it sounds like both of you had kind of different reasons, but mostly around freedom and culture and things like that. Tell me more about why you specifically chose where you are now.
So for me, look, I'll be honest, the taxes, right? Dubai has very low taxes, and that was a big factor for me in simplifying my setup and being able to keep more of what I actually earn. Basically, having a low tax country means that you can keep more of what you earn. You can either spend that on your family or on yourself, or save that and invest that. And so that was a big factor. The other factor for me in Dubai is it's very safe. So that's really good in terms of crime statistics, in terms of murder rate, theft rate, all these kinds of things. That's quite low. Dubai is also very well connected, so it's quite easy to fly around to many big cities around the world. There's also a pretty good meetup scene. So we have a Bitcoin meetup. Obviously, Simon and I go to that, and we have an Austrian economics meetup here. And there's just there's just good connections that you can make being here. So I guess in a nutshell, those are probably some of the key things. But then you also want to think about location as well. Like, so for example, I have family back in Sri Lanka. Dubai is a short flight to Sri Lanka, so that's like another reason why Dubai just made a lot of sense for me, right? So from my point of view, it's not like, oh, everyone has to move to Dubai. It's more like, be open-minded, find a place that works for yourself and for your family.
Yeah, for me, it feels like I came here by accident, because back in 2021, I was going to the Miami conference, and I was actually in Vietnam at that time. I was just enjoying the freedom in Vietnam, traveling around while everyone else was back in lockdowns in Europe and the West and stuff. But I was going to Miami, so I had to fly through Dubai. I didn't like Dubai at all. Like, my impression of Dubai, I just didn't like it. So I went to Dubai and spent a few weeks before flying, doing the Dubai-Miami flight or something. I think it was something like that. And being here, I'm like, wow, this is not what I expected at all. And now then I became a resident, so I decided to become a resident. And just the fact that, just what Stephan Livera said, like, the tax situation here is crazy. Like, you get a residence permit here, and now you're a resident, and there's no tax filing. You don't have to care about any personal tax filing anymore, which is crazy. And then you have all the other benefits. It's safe, it's convenient. It's you have a direct flight with one of the best airlines in the world to all the cities in the world. So it's extremely good to have us like a base place. So I think that's why I've been staying in Dubai, and probably gonna have this as a hub going forward as well. But because back when I moved here and decided to move here, all the rest of the countries I was considering Malta, Cyprus, Portugal, some of these countries, but they were all on lockdown, and you had to have 3 doses or something like that to get any events. I was like, screw those places. Those out off the chart already. It's like Dubai is like one of the few places you actually could go to. So yeah, that's how I ended up here, and I'm staying.
I mean, that's an interesting thing, because in a sense, we've I think always thought, at least prior to 2020, of Australia, Western Europe, even the United States as free places. But what both of you guys are telling me is that Dubai was actually freer than those places in terms of, vaccine lockdowns and, the doses required and things like that.
Right.
Yeah, I would say that was because of Expo 2020 at the time. So because they were having this big event, and the whole point of this event was to get people from around the world to come, they, by necessity, had to be more open for the tourism sake. So I wasn't here at that time in Dubai, but I understand they had an early lockdown that was pretty strict. But then after that, they were basically one of the more open places, during the hysteria.
I think it's because Dubai is this economic hub that's the all of the economy is just based on tourism and people coming here and spending money. So I mean, you can't just cut that off and just block everyone, because then you lose the whole economy. So I think they had to stay open.
Well, so let's get into sort of the logistics a little bit, because I think a lot of the people that are listening to this podcast, they have some interest in figuring out where to go. So what were some like practical logistical things that you had to deal with when moving to, Dubai, obviously, but something that can be applied to wherever you go. If you were to go to Singapore or Vietnam or wherever it is, like, what are some things that you should think about as someone that's interested in possibly finding another jurisdiction?
Yeah, so I would say there's a few things. Like, if you're moving for the sake of getting lower taxes, then you also need to think about how to become a tax non-resident. Now, for the American listeners, that's obviously going to be hard. But for non-American listeners, pretty much, if you research and you take the right steps, you can do this. So, for example, it may mean closing down bank accounts in the country that that the original in your country that you're from. Maybe selling your car, selling your house, kind of cutting off those other ties so that you can then become a non-resident. Of course, it will be different depending on where you are. So I researched that in terms of how to do that for an Australian. Of course, that will be different as a Swedish citizen or whatever, right? That's one interesting point. I mean, there's lots of things that you have to research, and I guess really one thing you can do is go to these places and trial run, right? Just go and visit for a few weeks and see, like, oh, okay, do I like it here? And what kind of entry pathways are there? So, for example, can I get a visa as a freelancer? Can I get a visa by setting up a business? Can I get a visa by buying a property? Can I buy a passport? These kinds of things. So there's kinds of or purchase citizenship, which entitles you to a passport in that particular country. So I think it's a range of those things, and we can dig into kind of those and how you would research those as well. But that's sort of a very high level view of how that's just some of the logistics involved. I mean, there's so many, but that's enough to start.
Simon, did you have anything that you wanted to add to some of what Stephan was saying?
Yeah, what he was saying, like you should look for countries that are very expat friendly, and a country like this place is very expat friendly. Everything is in English apart from the Arabic, so it's extremely easy to handle bureaucracy and some stuff like this, visas, and they're very open to open a company and get a visa here if you are from another country. And it's same with Malta. And then you can look there's a list of countries that are very friendly to live in. Like they don't care about everything you earn from other countries. So like, I mean, my core idea is like following the flag theory model, which is super old now. It's like 50 years old. The idea that you should decentralize yourself. So you should keep your citizenship in the country you comes from. Maybe not if you're American, but then you get your resident in a second country. Like just get that residence, and you can stay there, and then you can spend part of your life in a third country. So you just decentralize where you have your assets, and like that, and you become like you're freeing yourself from the system. Basically, it's like a hack that's been working for so long. It's just still working. Like you can be a perpetual tourist. Basically, like where you live, they don't really care about you that much. And the home country, you're just not registered. You don't live there anymore. So I think that's a great goal. And I think a lot of the people that are, when you go to Bitcoin conference, and there's a lot of people talking about this stuff, you should get your second residency at like Paraguay and all these places. There's a lot of these residencies that they don't tax you and they don't care what you're doing really. But you can tell all the authorities and all the banks and all that I'm living here.
Yeah.
And you even have the new Palau ID, for example, that I'm not sure if it's that great yet, but you can go online, get the Palau residence ID, and then you can open a Binance account with your Palau ID. Yeah, so, I mean, don't connect it to your home country.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things you can add there is, as part of your research, you can look at what are the countries that would be maybe near me, maybe from a time zone perspective. So let's say you're an American and you're looking at or a Canadian and you're looking at somewhere to go. Maybe you'd look somewhere in LATAM, right? Maybe you would look at Mexico or Colombia or Argentina or somewhere in LATAM, because the time zones line up a bit more easily if you're remote working and your team is also in North America, just as an example. Other things you can do are look at places that have low-cost entry, footholds, right? Let's say can you get a residence permit relatively cheaply, or can you get can you open bank accounts relatively easily? So those are a few things that you can look at. And then from the tax perspective, you might be looking at, okay, what places have either a low tax rate at the headline level, or look for this thing, are they a territorial tax system? And so if that is a territorial tax system, then they may not tax you on income that's generated outside of that country. Now, important point to note here is it doesn't just mean, just any territorial tax system and I'm good, because they may say, it depends on the type of work you're doing in the business setup you have, that they may say, okay, let's say I go to country X and it's a territorial tax country, but if I do the work in that country, depending on the interpretation of the tax laws, they may say, no, Stephan, even though it's a territorial tax country and even though your client is outside of the country, you are in that country doing the work in that country, therefore you are taxable. So these are a few little things that you have to sort of figure out, but you can, depending on how your business or how you are as an individual are structured, you can find a way to sort of lower your taxes. Now, of course, that's why in one way it's easy with Dubai, or relatively easy, because it's just zero personal income tax. Now, there is a 9% corporate tax, but even there are free zones and certain exemptions that are available depending on what you do. So, that's just like a bit of an overview. The high-level answer, though, is look for places with low headline rate taxes, or potentially look for places that offer like a territorial tax system where you can have your structure in such a way that allows you to pay less tax.
It's interesting that both of you are more or less like tax experts at this point on various things. I think for a lot of the listeners of this podcast, the thing that would be very interesting is, what about the current assets that you have? Not necessarily income, because a lot of the tax things that you guys are talking about are with respect to the income that you're earning, maybe as a freelancer, maybe as a business or whatever. But for a lot of Bitcoiners, they have Bitcoin, right?
Right.
They don't want to incur the significant capital gains taxes that come from a lot of those. What are some strategies that you guys have found to be useful to protect your property, basically, from government theft?
I think it's important to like zoom out and discuss, instead of just technicalities around tax, like discussing like what's the point of the whole like why are we doing this? And I think one idea I had like 10 years ago back home is like, okay, in this country you have to tax capital gains by 30%, which means potentially if I start saving all my money in Bitcoin for my family, for my future, and in 40 years from now I need to convert that into a house or something for everyone. Do I want to pay 30? Let's say Bitcoin goes to $1 million because they have just crashed the fiat currency, and they will say, oh, you have to pay, oh, you have this 10,000% of profit. Like, not because Bitcoin went up, but because fiat went down. And they'll say, oh, you owe us all this stuff, and it's going to be as much as buying a whole house, maybe. And like, that's my idea. It's like all that money that potentially I just have to give to the government, like I should set up my life to be free from that burden if that happens. So that's why I started to look at like which countries have no capital gains for Bitcoin. Oh yeah, Malta. I'm starting moving to Malta, and I will navigate, because you have to start thinking long term, like set up your life. And I was listening to your podcast, Stephan. Like I think you were talking with American Hodl, and you cited the book, the
Sovereign Individual.
Exactly. And you were talking about like the savings and compounding that interest of savings you save is like $1 million in like 40 years.
Yeah. So
you will have.
That
yeah.
is 5,000. So put it this way. It's if you could move somewhere and make a tax saving of $5,000 per year, and you could save and invest that, and you did that for 40 years, that number is $2.2 million. And put it this way, if you could save $50,000 per year, save and invest that at 10%, you would have $22 million at the end of that, that you could pass on down to your children or whatever. Go on.
Yes. So for me, it was more like if I can cut down on my like taxes, and I can start saving more, and I can move to a place which is cheaper quality life. Like I 10x my quality of life in general. Like let's say I stop paying for super expensive healthcare and I pay for much better, cheaper healthcare somewhere else. It's like my life quality has improved. I can just say for myself, like my life quality has improved a ton since the past 5 years, since I started to relocate and start changing how I earn money and how I spend my money. And yeah, so I think that's the number one reason why people should consider this, and they should think about their kids. And you should see the direction which EU, US is going with inflation, with living expenses, housing costs. Like at some point, people are like, screw it, I'm just going to go to Thailand and buy a house for cheap. And I think you get what I'm saying. It's like, it's about improving your life. And that's what the jurisdictional arbitrage is about. You can actually, if you can get a Western salary, live in a country with no income tax, and then spend it in a country which has extremely high quality of life to what you buy. I mean, it's just win-win for everyone, because where you go, they get your money, you're getting better quality of life, and the government get less money to waste.
Yeah. And so, Simon, I totally agree with you, but I guess let me just try and answer Jimmy's direct question, though, which is about how do you deal with capital gains tax? Now, that may not be a good answer, let's say, or this may not be a good answer depending on, of course, in many cases, it depends. Because in many cases, when you leave that country's tax net per se, they may have a rule. Now, in Australia, this rule is known as deemed disposal. You are deemed to have disposed of your capital gains assets at the point where you leave the system. Now, Australia particularly has a specific rule where you're allowed to offset that or push that into the future. So that's one thing you could explore. But depending on the country you're in, it may be a situation where you are, let's say, strategically taking a hit now because you believe in the upside and you would rather have that upside untaxed. So I understand that may be a tough, bitter pill to swallow, but you may decide that, look, in some ways, I'm betting on myself. I'm betting on my own ability to go somewhere with lower taxes and earn more. And, especially if you're doing this earlier in your career, earlier in your life, and you've still got a 30 or 40 years to run of compounding, that might be worth it for you. And like I said, that $5,000 savings, whether it's in tax savings or cost of life savings, works out to being 2.2 million. And then if you can save more than that, you're multiplying it massively. So there's a very big incentive to look at these things from a monetary perspective, and you kind of have to do the numbers for yourself. How much do I realistically think I could save? Am I an entrepreneurial person, or do I think I could make more once I've kind of gotten outside of the high tax country, gone to the low tax country? Can I make more over that next 30 or 40 years? That's, I guess, in a way, that's kind of the bet you're making.
Well, so let's switch gears a little bit. The tax stuff is, it gets very specific and depends on exactly where you're from. But I want to touch on something that Simon said, which is the quality of life. And I don't think a lot of people in Western Europe and the United States, they really understand just how much of a step up in quality of life there is once you move to another country. Specifically with like getting help on something. If you have a family, hiring like a live-in nanny or, full-time chef or something like that, it's actually much more affordable. Can you guys talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is something that a lot of people don't understand if they're coming from the Western nations. And part of the reason for this is very high labor costs or very high regulations that stop you having, let's say, a housemaid or a nanny. Let's say, unless you're very, very wealthy in the West, you probably don't have that because you'd have to be very, very wealthy or very high income to afford that or to make it worthwhile. But in places like Dubai, in the Middle East, in Asia, and probably even in LATAM, it's actually quite a common practice that people will pay and have a housemaid or a nanny to help look after the kids or to help clean the home. And it's sort of this basic idea that you can take away certain tasks that are not as high value, and you're working on your skill, which is higher value, and you can make more money that way. And so I think a lot of people aren't aware of that. And so when you move out of the Western world and you see, oh, wait a second, that's actually a common thing that people are doing. Like, it's quite common that people may have a Filipina housemaid who helps you, or a nanny who helps you with your kids. And so you can focus on your work. So that's a really cool thing that people can do. And it's quite popular also in Asia. But yeah, Simon?
Yeah, just hanging around with different Bitcoiners who live abroad. I've been hearing some crazy stories about how people are like increasing their lifestyle. Like, I have a Bitcoin friend. He lives in Africa and he has 5 staff, and he just works remotely for a company in Europe. I mean, if he was living in Europe, it would just be an average salary. So, and now he has 5 staff because he has a daughter to attend at home. And I mean, I have so many stories. Like, I know someone who he had his kids in school back in Sweden, and in government school, you're forced to go to school, which is a bit harsh. Like, it's illegal to homeschool in Sweden. So you have a lot of people that are moving to other countries like Czech Republic. So there's a huge homeschooling community in Czech Republic for Swedes who are escaping the Swedish school system. And I have one example of one I know who had his kids in Swedish school, and they told them you cannot bring fruits to school anymore. They're only going to be provided a half an apple because that's what the budget is for. And they said, well, can we just bring no, that will be unequal for the kids who can't bring fruit. It's like insane. And now he lives in Thailand, and he sends his kids to private school who cost less than the taxes he was paying for the school back in Sweden. And they have a mountain of fresh tropical fruits at school every day. He just increased his quality of life. I mean, this is the stories I try to tell people when they have to start reconsidering that where you live at home might not be the best. You should think more. Yeah.
And so I'm going to introduce this concept of home country bias, right? A lot of people have this, and it comes from investment. So people often only invest locally, domestically, in the stock market and not internationally. But I think we apply this in other ways also. So as an example, people just think, like Simon was saying, oh, just wherever they live, that's the best schools, best hospitals, best roads, best whatever. But that's not actually the reality. The reality is that there may be many other places that have, let's say, a lower crime rate. For example, the UAE has a very low crime rate. Another example is healthcare. So I found we had my son was born in the UAE, and we found we had a great experience. The hospital, the facilities they had were amazing, far better than what we would have had even if I was living back in Sydney. And so it sort of really blows your mind that in these other countries you can get better, not just like the same, but actually better quality services than what you would back in the sort of crumbling West with the high taxes and the bureaucracy, because they're just wasting a lot of that money. And I think in other countries, they have to be competitive. And so that's why you're hearing about medical tourism in places like Thailand and Malaysia and even UAE.
A funny story, when I was moving to Malta, among the libertarian Swedish community there was it was a joke called DDR mode. DDR is East Germany, right? So like when you go to another country and you suddenly get blown away by, there's no waiting lines for the hospitals. There's no waiting lines because rent controls for getting a rental. Then you just get like mind blown and your brain's like, what's happening? That is when you're on DDR mode still. You haven't really adapted away from living in a socialist country. And that's was a very common thing for people moving from Sweden to Malta, like experience like, wow, you don't have to wait for 3 months to get a rental or a year for hospital. Yeah.
I'll give you another
I guess
example.
The places you're from are, and I guess the places that you're from are far more socialist than you would think. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, but people living in it doesn't realize. I think it's similar in Canada. Like it's normal. Like you call the doctor and you have to wait a year for a surgery or something. It's normal, and they will blame it. Oh yeah, it's because of COVID. So we have a backlog. I mean, there's always some reason, and people go like, oh yeah, that's understandable. So nobody questions it, but that's why it's so important to move somewhere else. Just try it for a while, see how other country does it, and then you start to get a more like balanced view on how it actually should work or how it could work. And then you start questioning like, crap, I've been like lied to my whole life. I've been lied to that this system was the best in the world or something. So then you start saying, screw this system, I'm not gonna support you. You've just been screaming over, basically. That's my feeling.
Sorry, Stephan, you were going to comment on the, I guess, the jurisdictional like differences, like socialism versus democracy.
Oh, right, yeah. I mean, look, ultimately, you're like fish in water, and you don't really realize what it's like until you've actually gone and lived somewhere else. Now, I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture. Of course, there are challenges. Of course, there are other things that you might have to deal with, but I've been out for over 2 years now, and I find it fantastic. I think it was absolutely the right call. I look back at the craziness of what's going on back in Australia or in other countries, and I'm very happy with my decision. I think the other thing I would say is that most people are operating on a view of other countries that's maybe 20 or 30 years old. So they look back at some of these countries, right? And maybe if you were growing up in America or Australia in the 90s, you would have been like, yeah, hell yeah, it's way better here than in those other countries. But the world has changed. These other countries have grown, and they've come up a lot in terms of the quality of life that you can have, and the safety level that you can have, and the health that you can have, and the speed of the internet that you can have. And all of these things, you'll find that actually it's improved a lot in some of these other countries, and you can get even better value for money. So especially in an age where you can work remotely and you can obviously earn Bitcoin, then there's a massive freedom and there's a massive arbitrage there that's available to you if you're able to earn Bitcoin or earn online and then spend locally in a country where your money takes you so much further.
Yeah, and that's something that I observed when I was traveling through a lot of these places is that now that I'm back in Austin, everything is more expensive here than pretty much every other country I visited, including Dubai, which is not exactly cheap either. But relatively speaking, it was still much less expensive than Austin. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about sort of the long-term things that you're thinking about? Obviously, Stephan, you're raising a family there, and Simon, I'm not sure about your situation, but how are you thinking about the long term and raising a family and sort of having, figuring out what you're going to do in the future with respect to all of that?
Yeah. So for me, like you said, I'm based in Dubai, but I'm also looking at, okay, what would be plan B if we needed to go somewhere? And so, you kind of just want to have ideas in your mind about where you would go if you needed to. And so, as an example, if I have family in Sri Lanka, then maybe Sri Lanka is another choice for me. Or maybe there's somewhere else in Asia that would make sense for me. That's an example. But for the most part, I think Dubai and the UAE, I'm comfortable with that because I'm bullish on Dubai in general. Like I think more people are moving here. I think the quality of life and the standards are going to keep rising here, just because I think they're managing it a little bit better than some of the other countries. Nowhere on earth is perfect, but I'm comfortable with sort of the trade-offs that you get by being in Dubai in terms of the low taxes and sort of the quality of the services and the safety and these other aspects. And, but part of it for me is also having some level of flexibility that, if things weren't so good here, well, then you can go somewhere else. And ultimately, that's kind of like a market test, right? If the place is doing well, they'll attract investors, entrepreneurs, employees, tourists. They'll just attract people. And if not, then you go somewhere else. And so I'm just sort of keeping my eyes more open to those options because obviously, the next, 10, 20 years as the world transitions to Bitcoin, it's gonna get crazy out there. So you just have to try and be ready for different scenarios.
I think this place is great if you are like a young professional or you're earning your money and you're saving because of the economics and just all the connections you can make here because all the great people that are coming in and out here. So you can build your network here. But I don't think I would raise a family here because to me, this place is just a desert. So like I can't imagine my kids go out and play here. It's mostly highways and deserts. So I would probably find some place that are more down to earth, more relaxing. But I will probably just I'm planning to keep this place as my economic base, even though I might not live here full time. I might come here now and then, but just a structure. But I'm going to continue finding new places where I get a residency visa, where I open bank accounts, or just keeping all these flags. And I mean, when it comes to family stuff, I think it's important to find some local community. And there are like I mentioned, Czech Republic has a huge Swedish community for people that are homeschooling, for example. So that is an option I could consider when that time comes. But yeah.
Well, that's interesting that you guys both have sort of like different plans, and you have backup plans to your current plan, and you have other jurisdictions that you can go and use for different purposes. And I think that's kind of foreign to a lot of people that are listening to this podcast. They're not thinking in terms of, okay, how do I maximize the quality of my life by having, as you said, Simon, different flags planted in different places and using that for various purposes. Maybe your business is here, your family is here, the education of some of your people and community is here, or whatever. And that's something that I don't think people are used to, because like you said, it's kind of mind-blowing that you can sort of like pick and choose like you're in a candy store, right? Like, all right, I want some of this, I want some of this, I want some of this. Yeah. And that's a very different mentality to get into of like picking jurisdictions for various advantages.
After you hang around in this community, like these nomad or expatriates communities for a while, it gets normal. Like you ask people, oh, so where are you spending your winter season? Oh yeah, I'm going to go to Bali, or I'm going to go in Thailand. Oh yeah, sure, I'm also going to go. Let's hang out. And then after a while you speak to some people back home who's just grinding away in some office, they're like, oh yeah, my life is a bit different. I'm just flying around all the time. Well, some people are just stuck in some cubicle or something.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I can totally see my kids if I have some like traveling with me. Like we have our, like the mempool office is incorporated in Japan. We have our office in Japan. I could totally like see myself spending a few years there, months there per year, spending a few months in Dubai and then just traveling around. I've seen families like this, like these nomad families. I just look what Daniel Prince is doing with his kids. Like they're like on the move, and their kids are like crazy social because they're seeing the world and talking to people. They're way more social than I was when I was at that age, right? Because I was probably just stuck in some government school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And look, I agree. I think there's a lot of things that you can do to sort of make it work. I understand at the start you may think, oh, that just must be a single man's game, or maybe a couple could do it, but without once you got kids, you just can't do that. You know, I think there are people who are really doing that, and you know, you'd be surprised, right? Like Simon was saying. But that said, I will say it is also true that, let's say, children like stability, right? So you can understand where they have a bit of a need for that, but maybe you satisfy that in other ways. Maybe you sort of have a home base in one place, but you still do a bit of traveling around. You know, there's different ways to look at the world. When you look at it kind of like you said, it's kind of like you're picking from the buffet. Oh, I want a bit of ribeye, and I'd like a bit of lamb and a bit of, whatever. Like you start to decide, you know what, I don't need to just be stuck in one place with one citizenship, with one residence, with one business incorporated there, with bank accounts only from this place, with everything, etc., from that one place. You can sort of pick and choose and find a way to sort of structure your life in a way that you can design your lifestyle in a way that suits you.
Yeah.
And now, I will say, it would be nice if there was just one place you could go and set up and be there. Hey, wouldn't it be nice, right? To have your extended family there and, friends and people who you've grown up with. Yeah, wouldn't it be nice? I agree. But sadly for me, I see it like that's just not possible in today's world with the way governments are, because fundamentally they will abuse you. They will abuse us because they know they've sort of colloquially got you by the balls, right? They know they've got you, and they can turn the heat up on that little stove that you're in without you knowing, and next thing you know, here's a new property tax. So do you really own that property that you thought was your family's? Guess not. And you've heard, I'm sure you guys have heard stories of, let's say farming families where maybe one generation died, and then because of the inheritance tax, they weren't able to pay it. They had to sell the farm. These kinds of things can happen. And so I think what's happening in the world today with Bitcoin, with online remote working, is that more and more people are diversifying themselves. And yes, it's not as theoretically optimal as if there was one perfect place, but I think of it like maybe there just is no one perfect place, and you just have to sort of structure your life and deal with it. And you know what? Maybe someday when we have Bitcoin citadels, like real Bitcoin citadels, then maybe. But we've got to make it to that, and that might be decades away. So I guess that's a bit of my perspective. Hopefully that helps people understand a little bit, even though it's a different mindset from the typical "I've just born here and I'm going to die here" mindset. Hopefully it helps explain that.
Well, so let's talk about some of the downsides of this kind of lifestyle, because I think we've made it seem like it's like, great for taxes and family and different perspectives and, keeping your property and things like that. But what are some of the downsides? What are some things that people should know before sort of considering doing something like this?
So logistically, it'll be more effort. Depending on the place you live, it could be the weather that you don't like. So, for example, Dubai has a few months in the year, let's say 4 or 5 months, let's say like May to sort of September, that it gets really hot. We're talking 45 degrees hot. That's like...
that's in Celsius.
So. It's like 110, I think 110 or so Fahrenheit, something like that. So it's, very hot. But that's an example. You might have a little bit more logistical trouble with things, right? Because maybe you're doing things across different jurisdictions. You might see family less. Some family, you might see them less. So that's another trade-off that you have to be comfortable with. It's not all amazing and roses, but there are certain
barrier,
downsides.
maybe.
Yeah, depending on where you are. I mean, that said, there are certain places that you can go where kind of English is kind of very well spoken. Or maybe if you're a Spanish speaker, LATAM and Spain kind of give you a lot of choices there. So, there's a few downsides there. I mean, Simon, if you want to throw anything in.
Yeah, I was just thinking because it's for me it's a bit hard to even come up with a downside. For me, it was mostly that the first few years was the hardest when you have to adapt to new places and stuff. But then you get used to it. Like it's this barrier you have to go through to learn how to adapt to a new place, new rules, new laws, new cultures, and how to do stuff. So it's like this. I think, and I also think it gets harder the older you are. So like my parents were like, I'm telling them like you should move somewhere else, to retire somewhere else, because they love the sun and it's never sunny in Sweden, and they were like, no, we were too old to that. We could never do that. So I think you have to start earlier. The earlier you start, the less invested you are in your home country. Like they feel like maybe you paid tax your whole life. Now you want something back for retirement. You can't just leave. I think that's probably what first comes to mind. And you also have some nationalistic feelings sometimes. Like you think about your home country, like that, where you're from, where you're born. Now, you used to be nationalistic about that and how to feel. Like I become less and less. Like the years goes by, and then I see the development and like how I was just becoming worse, and I'm just glad I saw that coming like 5-10 years earlier. So you can have that kind of anger, but at the same time, like I see people that, like staying in their home country whole life and just complaining online all day long, like complaining, it's so bad here, like, but they don't do anything about it. So I mean, from that perspective, like you can relax and be happy about actually you've done something at least. I don't know.
Yeah, I would add that you have to really make it work for yourself and for your family, you know, depending on what you want, right? Like if you want low taxes, okay, yeah, there's places that can get you low taxes. If you want, you know, low crime rate, there's places that they can give you that. If you want, you know, you sort of have to choose what's most important to you and be willing to make certain trade-offs, right? And depending on where you choose, there may be some, you know, as an example, maybe you go to some of the Caribbean islands and some of those Caribbean islands have very low tax, but maybe the infrastructure is not so great there. Or maybe you pay a very high import duty when you're buying food and things there. Yeah. You know, I mean,
I think the biggest thing is that you have to accept that there are trade-offs. Like the supermarket is not going to have the same stuff that you're used to. and stuff like that. And a lot of people I've spoken to, they're like, no, I would never accept something like that. So you have to broaden your mind and accept that maybe eating different kind of foods than you did before, and different quality of food. And
I think, I think that's a great point. I think you need a little bit of flexibility if you are looking at this kind of lifestyle, because if you're very rigid, as an example, if you are very rigid and you're sort of used to eating like the best quality meat, let's say Australia, right? Australia has great quality meat. You know, maybe you're going to have to be willing to pay more if you're doing that in other countries, because maybe, you know, it's just going to be a different thing. But you could also say, look, I'm going to save this much on taxes. I'm okay to pay a bit more for my meat to get the high quality meat, because, hey, I'm saving all this money on taxes or whatever. So, or maybe there's a business opportunity that I can get here in this country that I couldn't back in the other country. So, but yeah, broadly speaking, try and look at what the locals are doing and see how they do things, or at least find expat and other kind of nomad communities in the place you're in and sort of figure out from them, okay, this is how you do things. Maybe this is how you get a phone, or this is how you get a bank account, or this is how you get whatever you need to sort of sort things out. But I would say if you're trying to be like truly nomadic, well, another tip I would give people is if you change places too quickly, it becomes very difficult to acclimatize and understand that new place, because now you're thinking, okay, how do I do laundry here? How do I get food here? How do I how do I find a gym here? How do I get a phone plan here? Like, it's too many logistical things to sort out. Whereas if you are a bit more deliberate about your choices in which place you go, and maybe you spend a bit longer in those places, then it can make more sense. Or the other approach, which is more what I'm doing, is more like Dubai is the home base, and I might travel around for a Bitcoin conference or a libertarian conference, but Dubai is still the home base. You know, that's kind of how I'm looking at it. But other people are taking a bit more of a sort of nomad-ish pathway about it.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you guys is that there's sort of like a kind of personality, and I think it's induced by fiat, where you kind of expect things to be the same. And that's definitely not the case if you are doing some form of jurisdictional arbitrage, and you can't expect the same things. So it requires some level of flexibility, some level of openness to new experiences, which I think Bitcoiners generally have. But it is something where, if you've been in the fiat system and everything's ossified, then yeah, you're probably not going to be happy, because that's kind of what you're used to. Whereas, for someone that's like you guys, where you're comfortable with change and comfortable with making trade-offs and figuring out what's best for you and your family, then yeah, by all means, like go and try these things and see what works for you and what trade-offs you want.
Yeah, I agree. And I think if we've seen through history, like people that take that step to migrate to another country to increase their living standard, that these people are so much more well off compared to the people that stayed home, right? And I think they measured like people from Nigeria who immigrated to US or something. You can compare how much their life quality increased. And there was even a study back in Sweden, actually, for the people that emigrated during the 1800s. It was a great famine back in Europe. A million people immigrated to the US. And now they made studies, and they can see that these Swedes, after a generation, had like twice the living standard than the people that stayed behind. And the people that left was actually the poorest people that felt most desperate, that wanted to leave. So just over and over, you can see how, you basically lifting your quality of life if you dare to do this move. And people are doing it for themselves and for their family, like the future of their family, right?
Yeah, I'll just add something there as well. So the irony is, at the time I left Sri Lanka, I was a baby. I was 2 years old, right? But my dad was 33. And at the same time, I left Australia when I was 33. So it kind of,
Nice.
it's just sort of like, it's kind of, there's a funny rhythm of how it can work that, and in fairness, if you're coming out of Sri Lanka and you're getting a chance to go to Australia, that's an upgrade, right? But it's just sort of like, for me, moving out of Australia was an upgrade because I could find lower taxes and find a different kind of culture as well. Like, it's not just taxes, it's also, not having to worry as much about politics in certain ways. Because in Australia, you're sort of forced to think about these things because everyone is, because it's such a strong focus on democracy and things like this. Whereas when you're an expat, to some extent, you're sort of floating above in a kind of loose way.
Well, you're not voting, so.
Yeah, but I mean, like, maybe they won't care as much about you in terms of, let's say, certain rules. They may not care about enforcing those on you because you're kind of seen like, oh, you're an expat or whatever. So in certain circumstances, it can be to your benefit to be in that scenario. So you can sort of get the better treatment, because some countries will treat their tourists better than they do their own citizens, right? In a way, in a weird, perverse way, right? Because citizens are the ones who have to pay the taxes, tourists don't. So it's kind of, that's a quick example, right? So it's just showing you that if you're, flexible, and if you are, let's say, ambitious, and you're willing to, move overseas or kind of go west, right? In the old sense. And I mean, if you think about it, America is a nation of people who were going to the frontier in a sense. So, it's not such a crazy idea, right? Like, it's not that weird historically when you really think about it, that a lot of people were doing this and have already been doing this. So, I think just give it a try, right? And here's the other thing. You can give it a try, and if it doesn't work, you can just go back. Right? It's not like forever. I think a lot of people think of it like, oh, it's like a permanent thing, or maybe they would feel embarrassed to go back and talk to their friends back at the, but ultimately it's your life. You get one of these lives, like go out there and give it a try. And if it doesn't work, then go back home.
Well, so let's talk about that, because I think what causes hesitation isn't necessarily the logistics, although certainly knowing all of that would help. It's sort of a lack of courage. It's like fear that they're like all the stuff that they don't know about is going to crush them. So like for you guys, you've obviously been through that, like hesitation at the beginning and so on. What was it that helped you had the courage to go out and kind of live in a different place like you guys have?
For me, I remember I was very hesitant, and looking back, that was I don't see a reason why I would be hesitant. But I think it helped a lot to like go to Bitcoin conferences and get inspired by other people that were doing the same, because there's a lot of these people talking about decentralize yourself, opt out from the system, right? You should get a secondary passport, right? Secondary, you have the Plan B passports, for example, and you have the it's called there's a guy from, I think it's from Czechoslovakia, runs a company called Liberty Travel, I think it's called, and he's selling like Puerto Rico, not Puerto Rico, but Paraguay residencies and stuff. So I was seeing these guys, seeing how they were freeing themselves from the system, and just because of my political leanings towards libertarianism and Bitcoin, like that came so natural to me. Like I have to do this. Like this is the only way for me. So I think for me it was very political, and it still is. Like I'm not going to change my mind because of out of convenience. I'm going to sacrifice convenience out of my conviction. And for a lot of people, a lot of normal people that are like stuck in the fiat world or believe the government and believe the fiat system, they're probably not going to do this. But there's a bigger chance for Bitcoiners to do this, because they constantly get this propaganda from the Bitcoin space about that free yourself with Bitcoin. The government is a scam. The fiat system is a scam. So you get more ideas like this, right?
Yeah, for me, it was a combination of talking to other Bitcoiners and seeing that there were already these existing digital nomad and expat communities, right? So as an example, you can see there's Facebook groups in pretty much any country. You can see like expat group for this. And, you can see like Australian expat group in XYZ country, as an example. And so part of it, obviously for me, as I mentioned, part of it was getting away from the hysteria, right? Like I just 2020 was what really crystallized a lot of things. Like I was already a libertarian for, decades, but 2020 just sort of forced the issue on me, because it was like, okay, if I stay here, they're just going to keep taxing me, and I'm still going to live in this woke country that's kind of going more and more left, and there's very little that I can do about it because I'm vastly, vastly outnumbered. Why am I trying to, quote unquote, stay and fight when it's just not looking very good from a staying and fighting perspective? I might as well leave. And so at that point, 2020 was sort of me planning my escape, and I was like researching and looking and, getting out of the jail of Australia. But, and then, talking to people who were already doing that. Like I was talking
I think
with
it's
Simon,
the realization that you can't change the system from within. Like we can't change the fiat system. It's like hopeless. With Bitcoin, you can actually practically opt out. And it's the same what we're doing with changing countries. You have to just opt out, even though it's painful, it hurts, it crushes some hearts. But that's what you have to do. It's just, that's what I feel.
Yeah, I will add there that I think, coming back to some of the downsides like you asked about earlier, Jimmy, one I didn't mention and it just came to me now, is you do pay somewhat of a social cost. Because there are a lot of people who I'm not as close with now because I'm not in Sydney anymore. I'm not there anymore. Right now, yeah, sure, I text with a few of them here and there. But quite frankly, there is somewhat of a social cost that I paid to do this. But fundamentally, I think it was 100% worth it, right? And I've made a whole bunch of new other friends, right? So I think you can... it comes down to the kind of person you are as well. Obviously, if you're sort of more going out to events, maybe if you're extroverted, you can make new friends pretty easily, and that can be a cool thing. But if you're maybe an introvert and you still want to make some connections, but you're not good at talking to people and making new friends, that might be a bit of a downside for you. But I guess for me, it wasn't so much, because I was already a bit more able to kind of make new friends and make new contacts in where I'm going. So but to be fair, there is some level of social cost you pay.
That's all pretty. It can be like sort of daunting, and I guess getting over those costs and like making the leap and doing it. It's kind of a momentous decision, right? Like it's not something that should be taken lightly. But at the same time, I think too many people sort of dismiss it out of hand because they're so comfortable where they are, even though they're complaining about everything that's going on. So I guess sort of like the thing that I'm curious about with respect to, I don't know, agency or whatever, is that both of you sort of expressed this concern that you really can't stay and fight in a lot of these places because it's just so hopeless in some ways. There are other people that are like, you should stay and fight so that you can at least fight for something better. Like, how do you deal with that? Because in a sense, wherever you go, you're going to have even less influence over the policy of the jurisdiction that you're going to than the jurisdiction that you came from. So, like, how do you think about that? And are you just sort of moving jurisdictions as they get worse and worse, or like, how do you deal with that long term, I guess?
I think the competitive pressure that jurisdictions place onto each other is going to be so far greater than using the suggestion box for slaves, which is democracy. Fundamentally, we are stuck in various systems around the world, and you can go make a little suggestion in the suggestion box. They can just say, oh, look, nah. Oh, hey, look, we investigated ourselves, and guess what? We found we did nothing wrong. And that's what the state can do to you. Fundamentally, I think of it like this. If you are potentially a high net worth individual, a high skill worker, or a high skill entrepreneur, in a sense, when you leave that country, they're getting hit in the bottom line. They need to start being competitive. And when more and more people start doing that, it will start driving competitive pressure. And so I think that's actually, and to be fair, I think all of these things help each other, right? So for example, I'm not saying everybody must go and be an expat or a nomad or whatever. There are different movements that can work. So for example, I like the Texas secession movement. I think that's a great thing. All of these movements, they can help each other, right? The Bitcoin movement, the secession movement, let's say even the New Hampshire Free State Project, all of these things can sort of apply competitive pressure to the state and make it harder for them to just keep tyrannizing people, because now, as the sovereign individual says, I think it's this idea of the tax cattle have grown wings.
You can vote with your feet, in other words, and that's more effective than a vote in the ballot box.
I think you also do have to assess the likelihood of where you are and what are the chances of winning where you are. Because think of it this way. Sometimes the culture and the way a place is can become very entrenched. So, for example, there may be a lot of people who are working for the government, sucking at the government teat, the taxpayer teat. And you might rationally conclude, look, there's so many people who are either directly working for the government or indirectly working for the government because maybe they're big contracts with the government, that I'm going to have very little success trying to push in a more liberty-focused direction in this country or in this state that I'm in. So why don't I leave? So I think for me, it's about assessing the likelihood of winning in the stay and fight scenario, because maybe the culture is just turning against you. Because sadly, whether we like it or not, the statists have control of so many things. They control the media. They control education, both the lower school, higher school, and university. They control Hollywood. They control, they control they just control so many angles that you have to be strategic and play where you think you can win. I think that's how I see it. I just didn't see a very high probability of staying and fighting in Australia. Simon, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I agree, and I think more people should just vote with their feet and take their money and leave to put pressure on the local government, right? I'm watching the European Union, and they're just imposing more and more crazy regulations year after year. They want to put full KYC AML on all Bitcoin payments. They want to put surveillance in all chat applications. So I'm telling everyone, if you're in the European Union, just leave the EU. Leave the EU now, before it gets too late, because you're not going to be able to do any business there. You're not going to be able to run a Bitcoin company. You're not going to be able to pay for your Bitcoin. You might not be able to sell your Bitcoin because you cannot convert it because you lack the paperwork to pass the AML policy and stuff. So,
you're very bearish on the EU.
Yeah, I'm extremely bearish. Yeah, so you should just go where, if everyone just goes to El Salvador, take their Bitcoin there, and that place, boom, you're going to see other countries that are following pursuit, doing what El Salvador did with the making Bitcoin legal tender. And I think we've seen it everywhere. I mean, Dubai, they want to get a piece of cake of all the crypto money here as well. They like have so many laws and free zones now for accept this kind of money here. So just to attract that kind of capital. So here I see they're doing the right thing. They're doing doing exactly the opposite of what EU is doing. They want to accept money in people and capital. In the EU, they want to kick everyone out, like kick out the rich people, basically. And I don't know what they're thinking, honestly, but people should leave and go to places that are actually welcome people. And there's tons of countries that do. They have programs. Like if you Google digital nomad visa, you get all these countries. I think it's about 100 countries that have special visas for people that want you to come there, lower your taxes, and work remotely. Yeah. And usually there's no Western European country on that list. They don't want you.
Yeah.
You have all these countries are from Eastern Europe, Asia, Southeast Asia, these kind of countries. They are hungry for growth. They want people to go there. And that's why they're booming. And that's why it's still very safe and secure. So, yeah.
Yeah. And one other thing I want to add here to the, should you leave or quote unquote stay and fight? Because here's the thing. If I tried to stay and fight in Australia, as an example, the corporate tax rate there, I haven't checked recently, but it's maybe 28 or 29%. The marginal tax rate, so the maximum tax rate, as in the top, once you're in the top bracket, is 48.5% or maybe 49.5%. And then there's other taxes you pay, alcohol taxes and whatever other stuff. I mean, I don't drink nowadays, but whatever. But the point is, if you tried to stay, you're putting yourself arguably at a big disadvantage. Because if you go somewhere with low taxes, that might put you and your business at an advantage. Because if you open your eyes to the world and you start saying, well, instead of just thinking, I need to do all my business in this one country, and start thinking more like, well, hang on a second, I can go somewhere here where they've got lower taxes there, and maybe I can hire remotely. I can also do an online business and hire from other countries. Instead of thinking, oh, I need to set up a business in Australia and hire only Australians and have an Australian bank account, maybe you're just not being as competitive as somebody who is taking advantage of the buffet of choices around the world. So there's also a competitiveness aspect to it. So even if you thought ideologically staying and fighting because you're trying to sort of save the country or in some sense, you might be better off getting out overseas and building more wealth, for your own family and for your own community. So I guess there's different ways to come at that, but that's one way to think of it.
Your economic power is way more important than your political power, is I think what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, arguably, you could come back after 30 or 40 years with all that wealth you made and then start your own media company and influence things in your own way. I mean, maybe that's an example, right?
I think you're already doing that, Stephan. All right, so let's start wrapping up here. For people that are thinking about this stuff, what's like the one piece of advice that you guys would give to people that are even thinking about changing jurisdictions or figuring out a new place to go?
I think that the first thing that everyone has to do is, like, number one, you have to be able to work online or set up a business that you can do remotely or from another country. Otherwise, you're basically stuck where you are. If you work in a particular field, you might have no choice because you're selling to local customers and you have to be on site. But I think, Stephan is doing his podcasting and I'm doing my developing, and we are a full remote team actually at the Mempool company. So you should try to pivot to doing something where you can do it no matter where you are. And after you reach that step, or you maybe already have a remote job, you can start start traveling more, start going to Bitcoin communities all around the world, like just going somewhere, staying for a month and go back and hang out with other Bitcoiners that are expatriates in that countries. For me, I was just like looking at countries I was very tempted to go to. Like I had this idea about Singapore being really great. So I just bought a ticket to Singapore. I went there, stayed a few weeks, hang around, met people just to see how it is, right? So you should take that first just travel step, because it has to start with travel, and then you can start just traveling for longer time.
Yeah.
And yeah, you can continue, please.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo that, to be honest. I think that is the number one thing, is try to get on the ground, right? Because here's the thing. Sometimes headlines that you read on the media won't be accurate. And you need to get on the ground in that country, or at the very least, talk to somebody who is on the ground, because they can give you the real reality of what it's like there. And in many cases, random headlines about a country may not be accurate, or they may be sort of written by somebody who is also subject to home country bias, right? That's some random reporter who's writing about a country they've never been to and just saying, oh, look at this terrible thing that happened in this other country. You shouldn't go there. It's not safe, or whatever. The reality of it is more like you can, look past those headlines and do a bit more research and actually get on the ground. And there are, I guess, one other tip I would give is a lot of people think the place they're in is the best at everything, but it's really not. And you can look and compare that objectively. So as an example, you can look at numbeo.com, and that's an example where it can show you things like the cost of living across different places. And you can actually compare what is the cost of living in this place versus that other place. What is the crime rate in this place versus that other place? And get a more objective sense of safety, of cost of living, or of other aspects that can give you an idea about what place might be good, what place might be bad.
Yeah, and I think travel is definitely important for that, because you get to sort of experience a lot of that firsthand and see, okay, you know what, I really miss this, or I really like this, and things like that, to sort of get a better gauge of what trade-offs you're willing to make versus which trade-offs you're not. I would also say that maybe you should get out of debt first if you are thinking about doing any of this stuff, because if you have debt, you're pretty much stuck. You really can't move. And that's unfortunately the reality for a very large number of people. Thankfully, Bitcoin lets us save, and it does give us sort of a lower time preference, so we are more motivated to get rid of the debt. Anyway, thank you guys so much for being on this podcast and talking about this, because I don't think we talk about these options nearly enough. Is there anything, where can people find you? Are there any things that you guys are working on that you guys want to sort of tell my audience?
Yeah, I mean, StephanLivera.com to find my podcast, Swan.com to find Swan. But yeah, look, I hope people consider some of the options. I think there are a lot of options out there, and people overly, I guess, put themselves into a cage of their own mind. And you can step outside that. You can free yourself from that and really open your mind to the options. There's over 200 jurisdictions around the world. What are the chances that you were just born into the best one?
Simon?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, SoftSimon, and I just want to recommend, if you're interested in this topic more, there are a lot of YouTube influencers like the Nomad Capitalist, like the Wealthy Expat, that is a little bit more targeted to the UE, and just the digital nomad a movement in general, which is huge now. If you search for digital nomad on YouTube, you find these people living in Thailand, working remotely. Watching these videos can make you inspired. I think it worked for me a lot when I was sitting back in winter, snow, cold, watching this video from people working with a laptop from the beach. Might not be accurate, but this stuff can tempt you to realize that there are actually other options you can do with your life, plan your life. Yeah.
All right, Bitcoiners, go travel, go try this stuff, and figure out if this sort of lifestyle is for you, and vote with your feet instead of your ballots. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Unchained Capital is a sponsor of this podcast. I'm an advisor to the company. I know the team well, and I'm excited for what they are building. If you need multi-sig, collaborative custody, or a Bitcoin native financial services partner, learn more at unchained.com.